From the early prison reforms under Reza Shah to the crackdown that followed the Iranian Revolution led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, women in Iran were slowly pulled into a prison system that kept tightening its grip. What began as a way to enforce order turned into something far harsher, where even everyday behavior could land women behind bars. And for many, the hell of these prisons still follows them. For most of its history, punishment in Iran was not about locking people away for years inside big prison buildings. It was more direct and often public. If someone broke the law, the response usually came quickly, with fines, physical punishment, exile, or decisions made within families or local communities. Prisons then were more like holding spaces, often attached to courts, military compounds, or the homes of local rulers. For women, the situation was even more different. In traditional Iranian society, especially under the Qajar dynasty, most issues involving women were handled privately. Families played a huge role in enforcing rules, especially around behavior, honor, and relationships. If a woman was accused of wrongdoing, it was often her family that dealt with it, not the state. This meant fewer women ended up in official prisons, but it also meant there was little protection for them either. Justice wasn't always fair, and decisions could be harsh, but they happened behind closed doors rather than inside a prison system. This started to shift in the late 19th and early 20th century, as outside influence began to reshape Iran. European powers were pressuring the country, and Iranian leaders realized they needed to modernize to survive. Legal reforms slowly began to appear. Courts became more organized. Laws were written down more clearly. And the idea of a central government with real control started to grow. But the real turning point came when Reza Shah took power in 1925. Reza Shah was not interested in slow change. He moved fast and aggressively. His goal was to turn Iran into a modern nation-state, similar to countries in Europe. That meant building a strong army, creating a centralized government, and most importantly, taking control away from local leaders and tribes. To do that, he needed a legal system that answered only to him. So new laws were introduced. Courts were reorganized under state authority. And for the first time, prisons became part of a national system instead of scattered local facilities. This is when prisons in Iran began to look more like what we understand today. Larger buildings were constructed, especially in major cities like Tehran. These prisons were no longer just temporary holding areas. They became places where people could be kept for long periods, sometimes years. The state now had power to arrest, charge, and detain people in a more organized way. At first, women were still a small part of this system. Most prisoners were men, often criminals or political opponents who challenged Reza Shah's rule. But something important was changing beneath the surface. As the government expanded its control over daily life, it also began to regulate behavior more strictly. Laws around morality, dress, and public conduct started to become more formal. There were also early signs of political tension. Reza Shah's reforms were not popular with everyone. Religious leaders, tribal groups, and political thinkers began to push back. While most of this resistance involved men, women were not completely outside it. Some were connected to political families. Others were part of early social movements, and a few began stepping into public life in ways that challenged traditional expectations. When Mohammad Reza Shah took over in 1941 after his father was forced to step down during World War II, Iran entered a very different phase. At first, his rule was not as strong. Foreign powers like Britain and the Soviet Union had influence inside the country, and the Shah had to slowly build his authority. But by the 1950s, especially after the 1953 coup that removed Prime Minister Mohammad Mosaddegh, the Shah's power became much more secure and much more absolute. This is when things started to shift sharply inside Iran. The Shah pushed modernization even harder than his father. He launched programs like the White Revolution in the 1960s, which included land reforms, education expansion, and more rights for women, at least on paper. Women gained the right to vote in 1963, and more of them entered universities and workplaces. From the outside, this looked like progress. But inside the country, there was another side to the story. As modernization moved forward, so did resistance. Religious leaders, traditional groups, left-wing organizations, and students all began criticizing the Shah. Some saw his reforms as too Western. Others believed he was becoming a dictator. Protests started to grow, especially in universities and urban areas. This is where the system turned darker. In 1957, the Shah created SAVAK, a secret police and intelligence agency trained with help from the United States and Israel. SAVAK was designed to eliminate opposition. It monitored people, tapped phones, infiltrated groups, and most importantly, it arrested anyone suspected of speaking against the regime. And when SAVAK came for you, there was almost no protection. Women were caught in this net just like men. Female students, writers, teachers, and activists were arrested for being part of political groups or even just attending meetings. Some were linked to Marxist organizations, others to Islamist movements that opposed the Shah, and some were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were taken to prisons like Evin Prison, which was opened in 1972 in Tehran and quickly became one of the most feared detention centers in the country. Inside, women faced the same brutal conditions as men. Interrogations were intense and often violent. Torture was used to force confessions or to get information about others. This included beatings, sleep deprivation, and psychological pressure. Solitary confinement was common, with prisoners kept in small, dark cells for long periods, sometimes weeks or months, with very little human contact. Many of these women were very young. Some were just university students in their late teens or early 20s. They'd been part of protests, distributed pamphlets, or simply spoken out against the government. Now they were inside prisons, cut off from the outside world. And that silence was one of the most powerful tools the system had. Families often had no idea where their daughters or wives had been taken. There were no public records, no clear legal process, and no guarantees. Some prisoners were held without formal charges. Trials, if they happened, were often closed or heavily controlled. Lawyers had limited access, and outcomes were usually decided in advance. By the 1970s, the situation had grown even more intense. Opposition to the Shah was spreading faster, and the government responded with more arrests. Political prisoners filled the prisons, and women made up a growing part of that population. Despite the harsh conditions, many prisoners formed strong bonds. Women supported each other, shared information, and found ways to survive mentally. Some even continued political discussions inside prison walls, refusing to completely break under pressure. By the late 1970s, anger across Iran had reached a breaking point. Protests were growing larger, strikes were spreading, and the Shah's grip on power was starting to slip. And in 1979, Iran flipped its entire system upside down almost overnight. The Iranian Revolution forced Mohammad Reza Shah out of power, and in his place came an Islamic republic led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a religious leader who had spent years in exile and returned to massive support. Millions of people had marched in the streets to bring this change. And for a short moment, there was real hope in the air. Political prisoners were released, families were reunited, and many believed the nightmare of secret arrests and torture was finally over. But that moment didn't last long. Very quickly, the new leadership began to see threats everywhere. The same groups that helped bring down the Shah started to disagree on what the new Iran should look like. Instead of allowing open debate, the new government moved fast to shut it down. Revolutionary courts were created almost immediately, often run by clerics with little formal legal training. These courts handled cases at a speed that shocked even people used to the Shah's system. Trials could last just a few minutes, sometimes with no real defense, no proper evidence process, and decisions already made before the accused even walked in. Prisons began to fill up again, and this time on a much larger scale and with a different kind of intensity. Women were pulled right into this system from the start. Some of them had been part of the revolution itself. They had marched, organized, and taken risks to bring down the Shah. But when they later questioned the direction of the new government, they were treated as enemies. Others belonged to political groups that were now labeled as dangerous, like leftist organizations, or groups that refused to accept clerical rule. And then, there were the women who were not political at all, but arrested under new moral laws that came in quickly after the revolution. These laws covered dress codes, public behavior, and relationships, and they were enforced much more strictly than anything before. At the center of all this was Evin Prison, which had already been used under the Shah, but had now become even more important. It turned into the main hub for political prisoners, interrogations, and detention. The structure of the prison stayed the same, but the system inside it changed. Guards were often young and deeply loyal to the new ideology. Many believed they were protecting the revolution from enemies, and that belief made them harsher. Inside, daily life became tightly controlled. Women had to follow strict dress rules at all times, including wearing the hijab even inside their cells. Behavior was monitored constantly. Even small things could lead to punishment, like speaking out of turn, refusing instructions, or questioning authority. Punishments ranged from beatings to extended solitary confinement. Some women were placed in isolation for long periods, cut off from other prisoners and the outside world, not knowing what would happen to them next. Interrogations continued, but now they were framed in a different way. Under the Shah, it had been about protecting the monarchy. Now it was about defending the Islamic State. The methods, however, often remained just as brutal. Physical torture, psychological pressure, and forced confessions were still widely used. Prisoners were pushed to admit crimes, name others, or publicly renounce their beliefs. Refusing to cooperate could mean harsher treatment or longer detention. What made this period even more intense was the uncertainty. The system was new, unstable, and constantly changing. Rules could shift overnight. A guard's personal belief could affect how a prisoner was treated. There was no clear structure people could rely on. Fear became part of everyday life inside the prison. And while all of this was happening openly, something even darker was slowly building behind the scenes. In September 1980, the Iran-Iraq War began when Iraq invaded Iran. This war would last 8 long years and became one of the deadliest conflicts in the region's history. It drained the country's economy, cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and pushed the government into a constant state of emergency. Inside Iran, this created a climate of deep suspicion. The leadership began to see internal opposition as just as dangerous as the enemy at the border. Anyone who criticized the government, questioned policies, or even behaved in a way that didn't fit the official line could be labeled as disloyal. And in a time of war, disloyalty was treated as a serious threat. Prisons started filling up faster than ever. Women were arrested in large numbers during this period, and they came from all parts of society. Some were members of political groups, like the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, which had initially supported the revolution, but later turned against the government. Others were connected to leftist organizations or student movements. Evin Prison and other prisons in cities like Qazvin became severely overcrowded. Cells that were meant for a few people were packed with many more. Prisoners slept on floors, often without enough blankets or space to lie down properly. Food was limited and basic, sometimes not enough to keep people healthy. Clean water wasn't always available, and sanitation conditions were poor, which led to illness spreading quickly. Medical care was minimal, and many women had to deal with serious health problems without proper treatment. Interrogations and punishments continued throughout the decade. Solitary confinement remained one of the most feared tools. Then came one of the darkest chapters in Iran's prison history. In 1988, near the end of the war, the government carried out a series of mass executions targeting political prisoners. Many of these prisoners had already been serving sentences and were not involved in any new activities. Special committees were set up to question them again, often asking simple but loaded questions about their beliefs and loyalties. For many, the outcome was already decided. Thousands of prisoners were executed over a period of just a few months. Women were among those killed. These executions were carried out in secrecy. Families were not informed in advance, In many cases, they only found out weeks or months later that their loved ones were gone. Bodies were buried in unmarked graves, often in mass burial sites. Families were not told where these graves were located, and many spent years searching for answers that just never came. After that violence, Iran moved into the 1990s looking calmer on the surface. But that calm was carefully controlled. The government had already shown how far it was willing to go, so it no longer needed to use large-scale executions to keep people in line. The fear from the previous decade stayed in people's minds, and the system began relying more on quiet pressure instead of open brutality. It became less visible, but not less powerful. Surveillance increased, informants were everywhere, and selective arrests became the main tool. For women, this meant a shift in why they were being arrested. Political cases still existed, but many arrests now focused on social behavior. The state enforced strict rules tied to Islamic law, especially around dress codes, public interaction between men and women, and what was considered moral behavior. Not wearing the proper hijab, attending mixed gatherings, or being accused of relationships outside marriage could all lead to detention. These were not always long-term prison sentences, but many women were still sent into the system, even if for short periods, just to be pressured and controlled. Inside prisons, the methods also changed in a noticeable way. Physical violence didn't disappear, but psychological pressure became more central. Interrogations were still intense, but instead of immediate brutality, they often focused on breaking a person mentally over time. Women were questioned for hours, sometimes days, pushed to confess, to name others, or to show loyalty. Other prisons across the country also held female detainees, and while conditions varied depending on the location, many problems were the same. Overcrowding remained an issue, especially in urban centers. Hygiene was poor, with limited access to clean water, basic sanitation, and medical care. Women dealing with illness often had to wait long periods before seeing a doctor if they were seen at all. Food was basic and sometimes insufficient, which weakened many prisoners over time. As Iran entered the early 2000s, something began to shift, not inside the government, but within society, especially among women. A new generation had come of age, many of them born after the revolution or during the war years, and they had a different outlook. They were more educated than previous generations, with larger numbers of women attending universities across the country. This is where a new wave of female activism started to take shape. These were not underground movements like before. Many of these women worked openly as journalists, lawyers, writers, and students. They spoke out about legal rights, gender equality, and social freedoms. Some focused on changing laws from within the system, while others used newspapers, magazines, and early internet platforms to raise awareness. They talked about issues like unfair divorce laws, child custody, and the legal treatment of women in court. The government noticed this quickly and reacted in the same way it had for decades, through arrests and pressure. Women who became too visible or too influential were detained. The charges often sounded vague but serious. Things like spreading propaganda against the state or acting against national security. These charges gave authorities wide power to arrest almost anyone they saw as a problem. Many of these women were taken to Evin prison, where the cycle repeated again. But something was clearly different now. By the early 2000s, communication had started to change. The internet, even though it was limited and monitored, allowed information to spread more easily. Families, activists, and organizations outside Iran could sometimes learn about arrests and prison conditions much faster than before. Because of this, stories from inside prisons began to come out more often. Women who were released started writing about their experiences. They described the interrogations, the conditions, the psychological pressure they faced. Some wrote memoirs, others gave interviews, and their accounts slowly reached international audiences. This made it harder for the system to stay completely hidden like it had in the past. The government became more determined to control the narrative. Monitoring increased, restrictions tightened, and efforts were made to limit the spread of information. The system didn't stop. It evolved, but its core never really changed.